I hereby call to order the August, test 1, 2. Okay. I hereby call to order the August 21st, 2024 meeting of the City of Prescott General Plan Committee. Board members present are, please say present when I call your name. Terry Sapio, present. Don Michaelman.
Present.
Tom Davis.
Present.
Andre Carmen.
Present.
Mary Fredrickson.
Here.
Ralph Hess.
Present.
Jim Huffman.
Present.
Rod Moyer. Okay, absent. J.D. Greenberg.
Present.
James McCarver. Absent. And Tom Riley.
Present.
Okay. And council liaisons, we don't have any, at least not yet. Sometimes they come in after the meeting starts. Okay, this is an open public meeting and is being recorded by the city. The proceedings are being televised by representatives of the public media, the public, local cable and/or radio stations, and may be also rebroadcast. The number of board members present is 9. It will require 5 votes for a majority. All parties wishing to be heard, including committee members, are required to state their name prior to speaking in order to ensure proper recordation. Members of the public are required to state their name and address for the record so that we may know who is speaking and to be able to contact them at a later date if necessary. We only have one item on the agenda today, and that is presentation, discussion, review, and approval regarding language for major plan amendments. And I'm going to turn this over to Tammy and George and
Here.
Ralph has a question.
go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah, Ralph Hess. I just noticed we don't have a deputy clerk. Are they going to be creating minutes from film?
Yeah, they're watching remotely, so she's doing minutes remotely.
All right, thank you.
Okay, George and Tammy, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're going to give you a little bit of a presentation to talk a little bit about background on major plan amendments and some of the criteria that's associated with them. We do have the 3 options that we believe are on the table. One of those was generated by staff as a result of reviewing a bunch of the example plans that were provided to us a little over a month ago, and we distributed those plans to the committee so you could review them, and a recommendation from committee member Ralph Hess for an option. So I think there are 3 options to talk about, but obviously during the course of discussion, if modifications occur and you come up with a hybrid, that's certainly within the committee's jurisdiction. So, one of the things that has come up a number of times is a discussion about how we calculate what triggers a major plan amendment in the process. I believe this committee has discussed it no less than 4 times over the course of the committee's life. With the last meeting, a discussion basically focused on an acreage trigger rather than any of the other parts of the trigger that we currently have in our existing draft. From a staff perspective, we were a little concerned. Tammy and I had a pretty good conversation afterwards to look at the situation and how major plan amendments are triggered. And we were a little concerned if we were just focused on a number and not necessarily looking at impacts on the community and how the different types of uses could have different impacts, and therefore maybe a single number is not the way to go. And as a result of that, we've thrown in a suggestion for you to consider as part of this process. And that has variable acreages depending on the type of change, and we'll get into that a little bit further. We gave you some examples in the packet just to show you how variable the number is and how much it's important and incumbent upon local government to make determinations. All of these criteria, all of these jurisdictions have additional criteria in the trigger. It's not just the acreage, but picking an acreage doesn't make sense if you consider that everyone who's looked at it has picked a different acreage. So it's not a universal truth that 10 acres is the number or 20 acres is the number. It's variable, and there are other criteria that need to be taken into consideration. You can jump ahead to one more.
Mr. Chair.
Ralph?
Yeah, this is Ralph Hess. Yeah, I looked up a couple of those homes or a couple of those towns, and some of the criteria, as you pointed out, are not just acreage.
Yeah.
And for instance, in let's see, which one is this? This is the town of Sarita. They actually have a provision where it says a change in any land use as depicted on the general plan land use map from a residential designation to a non-residential designation or vice versa. So that alone would trigger a major plan amendment for that city. And Oro Valley also has a number of categories under which it would say that it indicates the increasing the amount of high-density residential regardless of acreage, increasing the amount of master plan community regardless of acreage. So there are communities that don't require any acreage for
Right.
certain conditions. And I'm not suggesting that we necessarily focus on that, but in looking at the examples, there are examples in which there is also no acreage component. And each community, as we've discussed before, the state legislature recognizes that each community has to determine the criteria for its own community based on its own factors.
Its own circumstances. Yeah. So one of the reasons we showed you all of those again was because we were kind of overly focused on a number, and a number may not be the way to go. One of the other things that we've noticed is maybe it's helpful to reinforce the difference between a land use category in the general plan and a zoning category. They're not the same thing. They don't do the same things, and they can't be mixed and matched as the same things. Land use categories in the general plan are buckets. And within each of those buckets, certain zoning categories may be allowed. So there are zoning categories that fit in each bucket, and we're actually going to walk through them pretty quickly here and show you the buckets, the land use designation versus the zonings that might fit in them. Some zoning categories may be appropriate in more than one of the land use categories, so there's some variation there. That discussion, I think, will help narrow down the focus to land use categories and not get things too complicated with trying to address zoning within a land use category when the land use category is the overarching control.
Jim?
Jim Hoffman, very low density should be less than 1.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. You have a greater than 1. We have it correctly identified in the plan. So,
I figured you.
yeah. One of the other things that we wanted to talk about too that I think would be helpful is understanding that if you're looking at impacts on the city, and we gave you a map, which I apologize for, is really hard to read, that shows vacant parcels that are less than 5 acres, 5 to 10 acres, 10 acres to 20 acres and more. And much of the map is white because they're not vacant, so they didn't show up in the map, or they already have a pre-planned development on them, so they didn't show up in the map. So the map turned out to be less helpful than I thought it was going to be when I asked for it.
I thought it was very helpful. I liked it.
Helpful? Okay.
I thought it was, I could read this easily, and I think this is the best piece of information we've received.
I
in
take it
2
back. I
years
love
about-
this map. I didn't find it as helpful to me because I think I never mind. It's a planning thing.
I think it's very informative.
So we're going to talk a little bit about land use versus zoning, and we're also going to talk a little bit, and especially about the difference between the types of amendments that can occur in the general plan. There are really only 2 types of changes to the general plan. One is a text amendment, and one is a map amendment. There isn't anything else that can be amended, really. If you think about it, you can amend the text of the plan, and you can amend the map. So within each of those, we have to have criteria that either trigger a major amendment or not. And that was the other part of the process of making sure that we're looking at the map designations for the general plan and not confusing zoning as part of it, because it's not. So with that, Tammy's going to run through some of the land use categories, the buckets, and some of the zoning that fall within each of those buckets.
Sounds good. And also, I'd like to point out, James McCarver has arrived, so we now have 10 members present. It will take 6 votes for a majority.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. So which zoning districts, which is everybody's kind of gets focused on, could be in each land use designation. So like we said, this has been consistent with the last 2 general plans. They never use zoning in the general plan. They've always used these land use designations. So recreational and open space designations, that's kind of a no-brainer, natural open space and recreational space. Those are the 2 zoning districts that would fit in those categories. Now for a mixed use designation, it's a mixed use, but it's for a light commercial. So all the single family and multifamily categories would fit in there. SPC, specially planned community, would fit in there. Mixed use, because it's a mixed use. Regional office and neighborhood-oriented business. These are all either residential or a low commercial use. Then we have the commercial designation. So in our zoning code, in a commercial zoning district, you are allowed residential uses. So if it's zoned commercial, they do not have to rezone it. You probably never really see anybody do that to single family because that's down zoning and reducing the property value, and you're reducing the number of units you'd be allowed. So for commercial designation, all the residential would be allowed, regional office, neighborhood-oriented business, and of course our main 2, business general, business regional, and downtown business. That's kind of a defined area that you don't really see expanding or changing. So we don't really put that in any, but it would be a commercial designation too. Commercial employment is a little bit higher commercial use and industrial uses. In some of these, like in industrial zonings, it does not allow for single-family residential. It may allow for multifamily in some of those categories, but it is more of a heavier commercial, industrial type uses where you really don't want to see residential uses unless they're somewhat compatible in the area, which you would look at. But if it's already zoned residential and they're developing a residential, it would not trigger anything unless they ask for a rezoning to a higher density. So we have very low density designation for residential. That's less than 1 dwelling unit per acre. That's usually our RE 2-acre residential, which is kind of a holding zone, like similar to the county. The county, you have the RCU zoning, which is like a holding zone that was put over the whole county until other rezonings came in or planned developments came in. So that's what we see with the RE 2-acre. Low to medium density designation, that's usually 1 to 7 dwelling units per acre. So the single family would fit in those up to SF 35, which is 1.2 dwelling units, all the way down to SF 9, which would allow about 4.84 dwelling units per acre. Then we have the medium high density, which is more the actually, that would probably be the SF 35, not 6. And then multifamily medium and multifamily high is a higher density, but it also does allow for the lower density single family residential if it was going to be developed. So in looking at the land use maps, as we said before, we use designations, not zoning, on the maps. So this kind of shows you that map. But if you also look at the map, that's basically what we've created and we've already talked about and kind of approved in working with the other jurisdiction, with like the state land department and looking at really what we have out there. So we did separate open space and recreation, but we kind of lump that out because it's still basically, when we kind of categorize them together sometimes. So did you want to go from here? Are there any questions about that part before we move forward? About the different designations and what zoning may be allowed in that. Okay, good.
I think one of the things we wanted to emphasize is that it's not a one-for-one across the board from land use designations to zoning designations. The reason you're here today to talk about this is the requirement in ARS 9461 that says local municipalities have to determine a definition or a trigger for major amendment process. It is a requirement that it's either done separately or as part of a general plan adoption, but that requirement is to create some kind of conditions to trigger a major amendment. At the time it was originally adopted, major amendments were a much more complicated and substantial thing than they are now. The original language required all major amendments be held until one time during the year and all presented to the P&Z Commission and then to council at the same time. A few years ago, 3 years ago, I believe, the statutes changed, just requiring that you must process one within 12 months of its a submittal, so they can run independent of one another. You could have forum process at the same time at different stages along the way. In my opinion, kind of watered down the importance of a major amendment by not making them all wait for one time during the year. One of the things to keep in mind when we're looking today is that because that no longer is in effect and doesn't make you hold them all for one time, the impacts of the major amendment process are kind of spread out over the course of the whole year, and it's not something that's concentrated for a review all at one time. So you can't look at all of the major amendments that are proposed in one calendar year and consider the overall impact of them, which was the benefit of making them all go through the process at the same time. You could see the overall consequences. And today, with the current rules, you can't. You see one at a time and have to judge consequences of each one independent of the others that might come in during the year. Next. So our current criteria includes both an acreage trigger and certain triggers from changes from and to, from certain land use categories to other land use categories. The current language has the old designations that we've changed a couple of, as in we've opened up the open space designation to include recreation space and open space both. So we would need to make some minor text amendment to this if the committee chooses to stick to the current definition. I will tell you that at the time this was written, it was written because of development pressures that were in place in 2001, 2, 3. Different circumstances today, perhaps. This may not be appropriate any longer because of that. It was written for a very specific time in a very specific location in Prescott where we anticipated annexation and development to occur. So we're certainly not, from the staff perspective, pushing for you to keep this. I personally believe it's out of date and needs to change. So this is one option, though. It works if you consider the circumstances. The fact that we haven't triggered a requirement for a major amendment is not an indication that major amendments are flawed. It means that we've set the bar high.
Sorry.
That is, ow.
Time's up. Time's up.
Yes, vote. Oh, sorry. But it's one of the things to consider. It was specifically written at a time for circumstances that have changed. So we also have a proposal by Member Ralph Hess that you had some discussion about last meeting. He made some changes to clarify it and put it more in the format that we used for the staff recommendation, the matrix format, which is also kind of common among other general plans. So I think at this point, do you want to go through it again and talk about it? I don't want to explain your proposal.
Yeah, okay, Ralph Hess. Yeah, we've talked about it quite a bit, and what I had provided before, presented before, with respect to the zoning map changes, was all in text form. And after looking at not only what staff provided, but also meeting with, or talking with Deb Thalassides, who's pretty good at putting graphs or tables together, I modified what I had put in text into a table format in order to hopefully make it more readable to the public, more readable for us. And I expected that the public might just jump over the text rather than going through it. So this, the only difference in the table, I had actually also modified my original proposal that had indicated, had taken from the 2015 plan about any change in the land use map from a residential designation to any other designation, and it added other than open space or recreation space, but that wasn't included in the text that you just saw posted. So I thought this would be a more readable, understandable presentation.
Basically, that's the same that is written down, just in a chart form.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Quick run through, the staff alternative looks more complicated. Part of the reason for that is that we contemplated the impacts of changes from one district to another, one land use category to another, in a different way perhaps than we had looked at it back in 2001. Any change from certain types of uses to other types of uses should probably be a major amendment. Major amendments are significant for a couple of reasons. Additional scrutiny through the process. Planning and zoning reviews any major amendment, regardless of whether it's minor or major. So that part of the process is the same. City Council reviews any amendment, whether it's minor or major. That part is the same. There is a significant difference between requiring a majority and requiring a supermajority in a vote process for a change to land use categories that might affect future zoning or affect a proposed zoning, and you have to change the land use to allow that zoning. One of the most enforceable pieces of a general plan is that you can't rezone property unless that rezoning is in conformance with and furthers the land use map of the general plan. That's one of the things that's most enforceable by cities and by city councils. So having that change occur with a supermajority vote has a positive and a negative effect on the process. The positive effect is that it takes additional scrutiny and additional proposal and defense by the applicant of their proposal to convince more council members. The negative is that any two council members can veto the majority of council by voting no in a supermajority process. So there's a concern that we don't make everything a supermajority vote requirement for that reason, at least from staff perspective. And that we have some levels of criteria and maybe levels of impact that influence whether or not something is a major or minor amendment rather than more of a broad brush. Ralph's proposal is a little more broad brush because it's based mostly on just changing from one category to another regardless of size. We believe that there's some additional criteria that should be taken into account based on the size of the parcels and their proximity to other properties, and whether or not it's going from an extremely low impact use to something that may be much higher impact use.
Question, George. Don Michaelman. When we talk about with a major plan amendment there, you need a supermajority of city council. Do you need a supermajority of planning and zoning, or is that
No.
simple majority?
It's a simple majority. It's only at council that a supermajority applies. So one of the things, and I didn't intend to, grade your proposal, but there is one issue I'd like to talk about on yours, if you don't mind, if we could go back to that one. One of the things that Member Hess has got listed is that if you're going from a residential use to a residential use, it's not, and never, a major amendment. But if you can jump back to the land use sections and which ones allow, we have a situation within a residential category, go all the way to the next one, where you could have, no, back one, residential. There you go. So you have a situation where you could go from one dwelling unit per acre all the way to 32 units per acre on a development and never trigger a major amendment, regardless of the size of the property. So 32 units an acre on a 10-acre parcel is 320 residential units that could be put in and not trigger a major amendment. We believe that, again, given certain circumstances, that the size of the acres, the size of the properties should be able to trigger a major amendment, even if you're changing from one of these categories to another of these categories. That's why our matrix looks more complicated. There's more columns and rows to account for all of the different districts. And I think that's something to consider in the review process.
Ralph?
Yeah, Ralph Hess. I would not oppose that, adding that additional major amendment criteria.
Thank you.
Adding that to my
To yours,
proposal.
right. One other thing that we think is important to consider is, and Tammy mentioned it in her part of the presentation, the land use categories follow the same pattern that zoning categories do. There is a hierarchy that allows uses that are below particular intensity. So higher intensity usually allows lower intensity uses. That means in a commercial zoning district, you can put residential uses in by right under our zoning code. The land use categories on the map will not change if someone can put a residential use in a commercial zoning category and never have to ask for a rezoning. They'll never trigger a major amendment because it's by right. They're allowed to do it under the zoning, not affected by the general plan land use. So again, having some kind of acreage triggers where you have changes that may address changes that may be by right but still have an adverse impact on property owners, we again thought that was important. One other criteria to think about, and then I'll stop talking for a little bit, is the harder you make a process in government, the more likely someone will find a way not to follow that process. They'll find loopholes, they'll bypass it, or in the case that I was just describing, they won't make a change that would trigger a major amendment to avoid making a major amendment, but do something that is just as impactful, perhaps within the already existing zoning, and not address the land use categories again. So two things that are important to us is that scale matters. A small change may not have as much impact on a neighboring or existing development as a large change. And the categories of change can be significantly more impactful, going from a very low density residential, for instance, to a commercial designation, or vice versa. So with that, we'd be happy to answer questions and help you along the way.
And another thing I wanted to just kind of point out on this matrix. So if you, let's see if this will work. Okay. So if you go, like, why all these are minor is because they're down zoning. So if going from a very low density to open space, I mean, that's, it's kind of, those are all minor. I mean, we want to see it. But like a low medium density to a very low density, that would be down zoning, which you really don't see that because they don't have to rezone their property if it's commercial to allow for low density residential because it's already allowed by right. So that's why we have these categories over here above the black boxes because they're down zonings as minor because we probably will never see them. because they don't need to, except for commercial, if they're going from commercial employment, like industrial, to a residential, that could be looked at, but it is still considered down zoning, and usually we wouldn't see that. So I just wanted to explain why that has all minor up there, because you probably never see that kind of change. It's going to be the lower half. Is that where we see the impact? Like if you go from a very low density to a medium high density, so for a 10-acre parcel and very low density, you're going from the capability of 10 dwelling units to the possibility of 320. I mean, in a perfect world, the most they could do. That's a huge impact to an area. So when we looked at these, acreages and the categories, we kind of looked at it from a planning perspective and the type of projects that we see possibly coming forward based on the acreages that we have vacant in the city. So we really, Chelsea and George and I, all really kind of took a look at this and looked at the map and looked at this to try to figure out what would be a good acreage from the impact it would have on that area. So I just want to kind of throw that we didn't really take this, lightly. We actually spent a good afternoon really looking at the map and looking at what we see coming forward and what kind of impacts that these type of changes would have.
Andre.
How did you guys agree on 10 acres or settle on 10 acres or 5?
Well, based on the numbers that were thrown out at the last meeting, and just because of the size of the parcels that we see, and we're not set on those. We have an easy math prefer, just from planning, if easy math is better. But we're not set on these. These are not tied to these numbers. We thought about these, and this is what we thought, but you guys can change them. And just remember that what you guys are proposing is a draft, and that this can be changed through planning and zoning and city council too, or by the public, comments we get from the public, so.
Partial answer to that too is that we gave you a map that may be a little hard to read because of the size of it that showed vacant parcels in the city. So we looked at that in relation to where those are and adjacent already developed parcels.
Ralph?
Ralph Hess. Yeah, not that this necessarily is going to solve that issue with regard to acreage as to how it's going to impact that land use map, but I wanted to go out and find a parcel and see what that acreage was. So I went out and looked at the Courthouse Plaza. Courthouse Plaza is 4.48 acres. So that's almost almost 4.5 acres. Looked at the Findlay property. Of course, Findlay's out there's got, I think, 5 different parcels. One's 5 acres, which I think is the Toyota portion of their dealership. But it's that gives me a perspective as to what the size is going to look like out on the street.
Okay, George, any more? Do we have any more to your presentation? Wow, that was quick. All right. Any comments from the committee? Jim.
Jim Hoffman. Excuse me. Frankly, I kind of like Ralph's suggestion, even without the matrix, but it has to address the situation where you go from low density housing, residential, to high density. That would have to be added, in my opinion. But what I liked about the text was it's really clear, easy reading, even though you would have to add that in there. So I'm just going to mention that it may be appealing to people to be able to read something and go, okay, that makes good sense. Yeah, this covers everything, but it's a little more, matrices or mathy.
Just so you know, our intention would have been to have more explanation on how to use this. We just didn't want to go too far into it until the committee's had a chance to talk about it.
Anybody? Okay. James?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Jim McCarver. The other
comparative general plan examples. I mean, there were like 10 different communities, and the guidelines were all over the board as far as from Flagstaff to nothing to some of the smaller town or some of the other communities, and it was the 40-acre stuff. I see it as a way, I agree with you. I think in times past, development was felt to be important, and it still is, but I see this as a way to get a handle on that, a little more modern take on managing our growth. And personally, Ralph's example it gives you a bird's eye view of in space of what is 5 acres, what is 10 acres. So I wanted that. I like the idea. Personally, I would like to. I see downsizing even these numbers.
JD.
J.D. Greenberg. In addition to sitting through the last meeting, I watched it twice on television. And each time I watched it, I grew more in favor of what Ralph had proposed. I saw that recently, well, there's the Marina Street, which is 0.6 acres. So that would still be considered a minor, even though it had a major impact on the neighborhood. I also saw that there was another, I think it's 20 townhouses that went in on South Sally off of Bertrand, and that was like 2 acres. And that's a pretty long-term existing neighborhood off of Park Avenue. And I just wondered what was the procedure then? Did the neighbors get a 30-day comment period? They got nothing.
It was zoned appropriately, so nothing was required. It was allowed by right. So there was no rezoning. This is only looked at when there's a rezoning. If there's no rezoning required, like for Marina Street, that project, if they kept that area as a parking lot and adjusted their density, they didn't have to rezone it. It would be allowed by right.
But I'm leaning more towards what James just said in terms of a relatively small parcel that's going to change designation can have a huge impact on a neighborhood.
Well, if you please give us suggestions to add, because you guys are voting on this today.
Well, I was prepared to go with taking all the acreage out as Member Ralph had initially recommended.
Don.
Don Michaelman. From my time on planning and zoning and seeing a lot of things come through, I lean toward the staff one because if we make a lot of changes major, it makes it challenging for what P&Z does, but especially for the city council on this. For things that, we've seen them come through and we're able to take care of it. The public has the opportunity in both areas for the council and the P&Z to make comments on it and give their thoughts on it there. So I lean toward the staff alternative myself.
Okay. I've got a few comments of my own. Surprise. I very much like the staff alternative. At the last meeting, we talked quite a bit about what acreage would trigger a major amendment. And many times we've been quoted by Member Ralph Hess of what the Arizona revised statutes say about what is a major change to the general plan. I'm trying to find that page right now. And it says, it's in our packet here. It says a substantial change.
It's on the monitor.
Here we go. A substantial alteration of the municipality's land use mixture or balance. The key word in that is substantial. And I asked many people, what is substantial? For example, let's say you rent an apartment and your landlord is going to increase your rent. What would be a substantial increase to your rent? And many other, I went to Webster Dictionary. What is substantial? And for the most part, it has to do with the people that I've talked to. It's a percentage. And they'd say, well, if my rent went up 10%, that would be substantial to me. If it went up 1%, that's not so substantial. So if you look at how much land we have inside the city limits of Prescott, we have 41 and a half square miles inside the city limits of Prescott, at least according to Mr. Google. And that works out to 26,560 acres inside the city limits of Prescott. At the last meeting, we kind of agreed on, as a committee, 20 acres. 20 acres is only 75 hundredths of 1%. That doesn't sound like it's substantial. And on your matrix chart, which I agree with Don, I think it's very well, because it takes many things into consideration that we hadn't thought of at the last meeting. You're using 10 acres. Only one example had 20 acres. The rest are 10 acres. Some are 5 acres. Actually, there's a couple of them that use 20 acres. Well, 20 acres is 75 hundredths of 1%. 10 acres is, I'm sorry, not 75 hundredths. I need to change that by a factor of 10. It's 75 thousandths of 1%. 10 acres is only 38 thousandths of 1%. 5 acres is only 19 thousandths of 1%. When we're talking thousandths of 1%, that does not sound like it is substantial by Webster's definition or anybody else's definition, that thousandths of 1% is substantial. The other thing that we talked about at the last meeting was infill projects. We're all in favor of infill projects as the city's goal for workforce housing. Infill is, small projects, and Tom Riley talked quite a bit about the added expense and time delay if somebody that wants to do an infill project has to go through the whole procedure of a major change to the general plan. And if we want to be a town that is family friendly, we need more affordable housing in Prescott. Mr. Google, once again, the average price of a home in Prescott right now is, actually as of June 30th, is $606,978. So basically $607,000 is the average price of a home in Prescott. If you go into the surrounding bedroom communities of Prescott, Prescott Valley is $462, Chino Valley is $492. It's actually more expensive than Prescott Valley. Dewey Humboldt is $470, and Mayer is $300,000. So you have to go all the way out to Mayer to find probably family-friendly, affordable housing. Would be Mayer. We have a very Prescott is turning into, actually it already is, it's a retirement community because more than half of the population is of retirement age. And the retirees don't like change. They like Prescott just the way it is. The thing is if we continue with Ralph's proposal that any size would require a major change of the general plan or the land use map, what we're doing is we're turning the city of Prescott into a senior-only retirement community because they're the only ones that can afford the housing. And we'll have a citywide homeowners association whose knee-jerk response to everything is to say no. And I don't think we want to live in a community that is so exclusive as to make it unattainable and unaffordable for families and workforce housing. If you look at Sedona, Sedona is a perfect example of a community that's turned itself into one giant HOA. Everything looks the same. Everything is super expensive. The average price of a home in Sedona as of June 30th was $948,000. And Sedona's answer to workforce housing, they have a workforce housing parking lot where their workforce can sleep in their cars. I don't think we want that for the city of Prescott. So I am very much in favor of the staff's compromise proposal, and it is a compromise. You worked out much more detail than any of us have worked out, including Member Hess. And I think your compromise chart, it's easy to read, it's easy to follow, it adjusts for density in housing from very low density to very high density, and it has acreages that are reasonable because 20 acres is only 75 thousandths of 1%, 10 acres is only 38 thousandths of 1%, and 5 acres is only 19 thousandths of 1% of the land in the city limits of Prescott. And that makes it possible for us to have the infill projects that we need for making Prescott a family-friendly community. JD.
JD Greenberg, I just wanted to know, I see that we have the chair of the Workforce Committee in our audience today, and I hope that he adds some comments. But I know that they're working on certain exceptions or to existing rules, and I just wondered what would be the latitude that could, if we adopted this alternative, that could be applied to workforce housing that would be able to make it a reality.
But once whatever is adopted, there is no exceptions to it. You have to follow it because that's the binding part of the general plan, is that land use map and these triggers. So, but I mean, if you look at the map, a lot of the red are already platted residential lots. So there is going to be no change to those in the ranch. They aren't going to go to commercial, or Hacienda, or Yavapai Hills. Those are platted residential lots. And a lot of these red lots you see are vacant residential process, like in Granite Dells. Then you have AED came up in this too as yellow, but that has a master plan for it. Deepwell Ranch, we have vacant areas. That has a master plan. You have other areas. There isn't a lot of property that may be triggered by this because most of it, if it's commercial, it's going to go on a major roadway, which is already designated in commercial corridors. It's going to be some of the really infill in-town projects. We're just seeing some of these anomalies come in, like the 0.6 acres on Marina Street. Never did they notice that because it was always owned by the county and no one ever thought that building would go away or the county wouldn't use it anymore. So that's why there was never a change in the map, because no one ever thought about in the future that would change. So we actually went in and kind of looked at it when we created the land use map, let's fix some of these little anomalies that didn't make sense to make sure it's just a little bit more consistent, straighter lines. And but we didn't change anything except for some of the state land to meet statutory requirements for how many it's allowed, and per their request to make sure it's consistent with the adjacent properties, mostly up north. But there isn't a lot of properties in here that will trigger any amendment because most of it's already zoned appropriately for what we see coming forward. If it's commercially zoned, they could put residential, high density in there. I mean, in commercial, you're allowed, in a perfect world, in a planned area development, 32 dwelling units per acre. So that's not going to change. Even if it's designated as low density or anything else, that zoning's already in place. So it's only when they request a rezoning, and we're not seeing a lot of that except in some little small areas that we knew were going to be someday commercial, and it's already designated commercial on a map. So.
Ralph?
No, go ahead. You had a comment?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Tom Davis. I like the direction staff went with that information, and as I recollect, we went around the room talking about acreages, and I do believe I recollect that we talked about, at least I talked about, you can't divorce acreage from use. You can't say that 100 acres of open space is more impact, or there's more impact to a 32 the acre land use. So I like where they went with the matrix and so forth. I'm not totally sold on the acreage, but I like the direction they're going. And I looked at it in a different way than and it came to probably the same conclusion the chairman did, is if you look at that map with the properties on it, and I'm looking at what would be substantial on the vacant land and on all those parcels, and it just, the category, and enlarge it here, my iPad doesn't like that map. The category of 10 to 20 acres is right about there. It's right about where you're seeing a substantial effect on the community, and if there's a change, let's say from low medium density to commercial or commercial employment, that's a major change and almost a relatively smaller acreage. Whereas a change from low medium density to mixed use is not that great of a change as an impact or a substantial alteration to the land use mix or the balance in the community. So in general, I like where the staff was going, and I, again, would want to look harder maybe in the future at, and I will get an opportunity in the future to look at the acreage figures that relate to that. So that's my point.
Any other comments? Ralph?
Yeah, Ralph Hess. Ralph Hess. Would you put up the statute again, please? Yeah, I'm going to suggest that when the legislature passes a statute, all of the words are important. So when it says here, effects of a substantial alteration of the municipality's land use mixture or balance, the reason that it's bolded and underlined here is because staff looks at that being the entire phrase being important. And it's because substantial is not going to be just quantified. It's not going to just be acreage. It's going to also be the quality of the different land uses. And that's why what we've been told by staff is that each of the land use designations is important in considering what impact it's going to have on the rest of the property, the adjacent property. And for that reason, those issues need to be addressed qualitatively as well as what you're saying is the size. I'm saying the size doesn't matter. That didn't come out right. Okay, but I'm saying the acreage doesn't matter. So to focus on what is going to be a substantial change in mixture or balance. The one thing, though, that I will say is quantifiable, which I don't believe is as significant as been kind of proposed here, is that the supermajority requirement for a major plan amendment is 5 votes. A majority vote that's required otherwise is 4 votes. So it's only requiring one more vote for a major amendment, major plan amendment out of the council.
No, it's 5.
No, it's 2/3. It's a
Prop
2.
400 is 6 because that requires 3/4 majority, and this statute from Arizona is 2/3 majority, which is 5 votes. Ralph is correct on that.
Right, so it's 2/3 majority, so it only requires one more vote. And we do, as the chair has just mentioned, we have Prop 400, has a supermajority requirement. Under the charter, if the city passes an emergency measure, that requires a supermajority. That's actually 3/4 and requires 6 votes because it's an important aspect. If you pass an emergency measure, it's not subject to a referendum, and that our council, because that's a charter provision, as well as the state constitution, sets forth both those supermajority requirements, because if you're going to deny the citizens the opportunity to have a referendum on a particular ordinance, they want to make sure that the council has a supermajority approving that ordinance. And so a major amendment requiring 5 votes instead of 4 signifies the importance of that particular amendment quantifiably and qualitatively. And so, I still haven't heard any comments indicating that the acreage that's being proposed is anything other than arbitrary, because we still don't have any indication on how that's going to impact these individual parcels that are on the land use map. So I'm, of course, supporting my own suggestion and suggesting that it's not going to be a major burden on the community or council. Thank you.
James?
This is Jim McCarver. Just a quick question. These recommendations will fall into place if for any land that we annex into the city limits. If we have a big, huge prairie out north and we annex it in, and if they make zoning changes, it would fall under these plans.
If they make zoning changes after the annexation, they potentially could. The initial bringing the property in through an annexation sets a land use category and sets a zoning that's not subject to a major amendment. Changes to that after its annexation would subject it to the major amendment process. And in regard to the question about arbitrary, any acreage numbers we come up with are going to be somewhat arbitrary. There's no universal correct number. So.
And speaking of that, the example you gave us 18 different cities. Of the 18, only one community, Flagstaff, has no acreage specified.
That's not right.
We sent you the full major amendment definitions for them a little over a month ago. And if you read through all of those, several of them have certain category changes that aren't triggered
By acreage.
regardless of acreage. Some of them don't have acreage requirements at all. They use a different kind of designation. They use land use categories. It's literally all over the place. It's literally all over the place as far as how communities across the state do it. Most of them have some form of acreage involved in some of the land use changes, not necessarily a universal single number. In fact, none of them have a universal single number.
And the staff recommendation uses 3 sizes, 20, 10, and 5 acres. And once again, we're talking thousandths of 1% on each one of those. And 5 acres is 19 thousandths of 1%. That does not sound substantial.
We do also the land use category, the first land use category in the orange column, the change from open space to anything else is regardless of size. So that change would not involve an acreage at all.
Which one?
Any change.
Which one?
So the very first First
The very
column.
first one.
So if you go from open space to anything else, it's a major amendment regardless of size.
Okay, so that would be 0. So you actually do have 0. You use 20, 10, 5, and 0. You've got all 4 sizes. JD?
I'm getting signals from the audience that Mr. Fan has to leave. So if we
Okay.
want to get any input from him.
Sure, that sounds good. Let's get some public input. Come on. Come and speak.
Step up.
Thanks, Mike.
And I will be brief. Mike Fan was the chair just off of the Workforce Housing Committee. I have been watching how this has progressed, and I guess my concern is indeed what you mentioned. I grew up here. I went to Lincoln Elementary School. Prescott is not just becoming a retirement community; it's becoming a bit of an elitist community, and an elitist community. We're losing families. We're definitely losing our workforce. The vision that I would ask this committee to look at is, what do we want Prescott to look like in 20 years? And do we want families to live here, and do we want our workforce to be able to live here? So the more hurdles we put in the way, the more difficult that is to achieve what I say should be all of our vision. And that's a vision for a complete community with kids and young families. So please be cautious as you move forward in your deliberations on what hurdles you put up. From workforce housing, there is a ton of them already. I mean, we're going to have a really hard time addressing that challenge. And if we put more conditions on somebody coming in and say, hey, I think I've got an idea on how I can build some affordable units, if we have a general plan that he says, well, the first thing I've got to do is amend a general plan for a major amendment, and I've got a plan out there that everybody's looking at, says, well, that doesn't follow the plan that we've all agreed to. So you're kind of fighting a losing battle before you even start. And people that want to bring their business and come to Prescott, they're going to go somewhere else. And unfortunately, they're going to go right outside of our community. And what's going to happen is we're going to see that traffic. We're going to see the crime that brings and everything else. But we're not going to get a sales tax. Now I can get on a soapbox and really get going. But anyway, thank you for a moment. And good luck.
Well, thank you, Mike. And I agree with you. Prescott, if we go down this path of everything is a major change, it will turn Prescott into an elitist community. And once again, I've used Sedona already once as an example. I'll use Sedona again. One of the nicest restaurants in Sedona is actually the airport restaurant. Go have lunch at the Sedona Airport Restaurant. It's great. And while you're there, look at all the private jets that come in and out of the Sedona Airport. Sedona's become so elitist that the jet set millionaires are pushing out the ordinary millionaires in Sedona. And do we want that in Prescott?
Thank you all. Sorry.
Thank you, Mike.
Can I just ask staff just to repeat? I'm sorry, probably more for my benefit than anybody's, but is the difference between the process of a major amendment versus a minor amendment without the supermajority being in play? What else happens there?
Walk through the steps.
Sure. So the process for a minor, so we put triggers for minor amendments too, because that is a change to your map. It still goes through a public hearing process. So when someone submits a rezoning application, one of the first things we do is look at our map. And we're like, okay, this is not in conformance. Okay, does it trigger a major amendment? Yes or no? So if it's a minor amendment, the only difference between a minor and a major amendment is that the minor runs concurrently with the zoning map change, and there's no additional comment period. A major amendment, the only difference is you have a 60-day comment period that people forget anyways after 2 weeks that they got a notice. And and this is for a reality that we see. And then it requires the supermajority vote. So that's the only difference. With a minor, it's just the regular vote with the rezoning. And then the major, it just has that 60-day comment period trigger and the supermajority. That's the only difference between a minor and a major. And, we know there's going to be changes to the map, but so when we come up, and then the minor is a separate application too, but we run it concurrently with the rezoning map, like we did with the Marina Street one. And then we had one other one too up on Willow Creek Road that recently in the last few years. So we've had minor amendments, but a majority of the projects that have come through for rezonings are in compliance with our land use map.
Thanks, George.
I could add one more thing to that, and we talked about it very briefly last meeting. That and Mr. Fan mentioned it today. Infill projects are often the smaller scale, the size that you're looking for providing workforce housing. Smaller scale often can mean that you can get project in an area where you wouldn't be able to get something that's a giant projects. Workforce housing type of development. So we, from a planning side, like to see infill development, and we worry a little bit about creating a process that is more difficult for infill development to occur. Because again, I think we mentioned it last time, there's a difference in the scale of financial patience between a large project and a small project. Large project can have finance outstanding for years while they go through processes, and a small project could lose its financing if it takes a long time. So I don't know how significant the 60-day comment period would be in such a project, but it is something to at least keep in the back of your mind that it might have an impact.
And there's still a comment period during the normal rezone
Yes.
process, isn't there?
And between Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council, it still has to go ask for water. So we already have this other barrier in there, request that they have to go through is for water allocation. So they go to Planning and Zoning, they get a recommendation for the zoning, then they go to Water Issues Subcommittee for water for a recommendation for what they need for their project, and then all that goes to City Council together for consideration.
So there are still many hurdles that have to be jumped over in order to go through the normal process.
And right now, financing for multifamily is very difficult. We have a bunch of them that have been out there, that have been approved through Planning and Zoning and City Council and got their water, but they can't get the financing, or it's very difficult to get it right now. Mm-hmm. And so when all of them are stalled. And then they're losing their water allocation because the water's only good for a year. Then they have to reapply and go back through that process. So we don't, like George said, we just don't want to put anything that's going to trigger these infill projects that we really need in the city of Prescott to make it a family-friendly community, other than what we see now.
That's a really good point. I noticed that Deborah Thalassides has submitted a comment card. Deborah, would you like to come up and talk?
Got one more.
I will. No, I will.
Okay, now I can't see the chart. Deb Thalassides, Meadowbrook Road. Had a question on the chart for staff. So going across the top row, that is the from. And then going down the left column is the two. Okay. So what makes sense to me is after every black block, the amendments become major, and you explained why that is. The exception is this column right here, going from very low density to low to medium density, it's a minor amendment. Could you talk about why that is?
Can I borrow the mic?
Yeah.
So the very low density is less than 1 unit per acre, and the low to medium density is 1 to 7. So relatively minor impact if you count the number of houses, for instance, on a 10-acre lot. So you could go from 1 up to 7, as opposed to some of the other designations in the greater distances or greater potential impacts, like going to this one where you could go up to 32. So it was just, we felt the scale was close enough that those two probably weren't going to trigger a major amendment.
Okay, thank you, because I just noticed that there. I got to look at my notes here. I wanted to address, and I keep hearing it as it's kind of like the new buzzword, affordable housing, because I've lived and I've worked in cities where there have been housing authorities and there have been affordable housing programs, both for employees within the city and from other employers. Mr. Fan just said we're fighting a losing battle if we get more restrictive. And I'd like to ask, what happened the last 2 decades? The 40 acres was in place since 2003. 21 years later, we're still lamenting that we don't have affordable housing. And the reason isn't because anybody's trying to prevent it, it's because it takes money to encourage it. It takes more than just making regulations more fluid for developers to build affordable housing. Tammy referenced the current market conditions where it's difficult to get financing for multifamily housing. The market plays a huge role in the price of housing, as I think all of you know. It's going to take a pretty heavy lift for Prescott, and it's going to take money and subsidizing to get affordable housing, and the community hasn't had a conversation around that. We're just focused on regulations. We've always been focused on regulations or lowering impact fees. It hasn't produced the result that we're looking for. So I wish Mr. Fan were still here because I think there's other things we need to be looking at. Last thing I wanted to point out, let me just look here. One of the concerns that I know myself and other people that I've talked to have is not, George, you all said there's very rarely downzoning, but I seem to recall that sometime around 2017, there were several developments to the north that had commercial land that was sitting vacant because there weren't quote unquote enough rooftops to support commercial. They were rezoned to residential. They weren't? So they're still sitting out there vacant.
Or there's residential. Sorry. In many cases, in one case in particular, in the Granite Dells Estates, they're zoned commercial, but they built a residential neighborhood in it. So again, under the hierarchy, they could build residential. They didn't build the commercial that they originally intended, but they didn't rezone, so there was no trigger to change the map.
Okay, so I just want to be clear. So the plan amendment process, because we have that hierarchical zoning, which a lot of cities don't have, you would, if it's zoned commercial, but you want to do single family, you can just go do it.
Under our current zone.
Okay. Last question. Why doesn't Prescott have an institutional use bucket? And I'm thinking about on the map you showed, there's a big piece that shows this open space out by the airport. It's not open space. I'm not going out there to play or hike or anything. And we don't have an institutional use bucket. And I'm wondering if that's something you all would consider. It's pretty commonly used. It'd be for like the courthouse. It could be for this building. It could be for airport protection zone. And that's just a comment question.
That's certainly a possibility.
Okay. Anybody else? Tom, I've been waiting for you, Tom. You've been awfully quiet today.
I think that, actually I think JD hit on something that was very important, and that was the quality of the neighborhoods, not necessarily the size of the parcel. And I think that that's important. I think it's very important. And I think that one of the things that Mr. Hess's proposal would do is absolutely route that. Would absolutely route it. By way of example, if I wanted to go, and I think, George, you gave the example, if I wanted to go from residential low density or residential to a very high density residential, it's not a major plan amendment. And if I do it on 10 acres, 20 acres, 50 acres, 100 acres, not a major plan amendment, and it's going to impact the rest of the neighborhood in that area. So I think that not quantifying something is not working. It won't work. There will be the unintended consequences that can come from just the straight across one or the other. I can give several examples. One of them was the one we just went through planning and zoning, and that was the Marina Street one, where the Marina Street one, the basic question there was if we were allowed to change the zoning, if they were allowed to change the zoning of that one little tiny parcel from this to that, then all the apartment buildings there could have been 2-story tall. Well, we started throwing roadblocks in their way, and they have now said, screw it. We're not going to change the zoning on that, and we're just going to put in 3-story buildings because that's what we can do. You know, and that's the way that is. That's unintended consequences. In an area like that, the 2-story buildings would have been much more appropriate. And I think that by just going straight across the board, you're going to set up a plethora of those kinds of things happening. Another example that is not being proposed but could be proposed. If there is a commercial parcel, and that commercial parcel is best used for housing, probably not high-end housing, probably used for maybe alternative for workforce housing or affordable housing, whatever you want to call it, that's going to take a major plan amendment. Because if I went from commercial to residential, according to Member Hess's thing, then that's going to take a major plan amendment. I don't think we want to do that. I think we want to be careful about how we're going to do major plan amendments. The staff alternative that they have, I mean, we can argue the acreages all the time, but if you take a look at the vacant land areas, most of the small parcels in that area, you know, are less than the threshold that are put out in here. If I were to go in and buy up, let's say, a large section of the Dexter neighborhood, you know, and I wanted to put in a different kind of housing unit in that particular area, then I could just go ahead and do that. I could do it. I could do that outright because it's not a major plan amendment. It's zoned the way I want it and all that kind of good stuff. But there could be a potential impact. As a matter of fact, there's one development out there now that's kind of stalled at the moment, but it could have a major impact on that community. So I agree that the quality of the neighborhood is very important. And I think that the only way to help protect the quality of the neighborhood is to quantify, in some measure, those different interactions the way you've done it on this the staff alternative, which I particularly like. One of the things I'd also like to put in, we keep talking about things like, you know, use the word, Mr. Chairman, hurdles. And I like to think of, well, yeah, if I'm a developer, it's a hurdle. You know, if I'm a citizen, it's you have processes in place, and we have a lot of processes in place to be able to protect you and protect your neighborhood. There's a plethora of these laws in there. You go get the zoning code in this area, and I guarantee you will not suffer from insomnia. And you will see that there are a number of different issues that have to be addressed as you go through the process. Staff is not willy-nilly just sitting there rubber stamping stuff as it comes through. There's a whole process that you go through. There are, 4 or 5 different meetings before you even get to the point where the application is accepted? You know, things. So there's a lot of processes that we have in place that are protections for neighborhoods and protections for uses and associated uses. So again, I say that the staff alternative gives us the opportunity to avoid unintended consequences. It gives us, I think, a better methodology for deciding what's a major plan amendment and what's a minor. And I could give less than a rat's patoot how many votes it takes to get from one to the other in a major. You know, it's one more vote on council. You know, that's the makeup of council, and the voters decide that every couple of years. You know, so those are issues that, you know, are not part of things that we can be really concerned about or should be concerned about. What we should be concerned about, though, is, again, I think that Mike was right on when he says we're an elitist community. We sure as heck are. We're a lot more elitist now than 20 years ago. And I think that that's a problem. I think it's a huge problem. And when we think that we're going to be protecting ourselves, we're kind of kidding ourselves. We're not trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to avoid change. We're trying to avoid accepting change. And that in and of itself is an incredibly elitist point of view. So for my 2 cents, I think the staff alternative, the way it's proposed right now, is the way that this should go forward. And again, there are going to be several different places that it's going to be meeting more and more scrutiny as we go along. And I think that as it goes through the process and the public process and the planning and zoning process, before it gets to council, again, the final thing, there's enough time in there where if the majority of folks and the majority of comments are coming back saying, you know, we want to be an elitist community, we want to be Sedona squared, then we have the opportunity to make that. Council has the ultimate opportunity, not the ultimate one, but they have the opportunity to make those changes. And I think we should let the process go through in what I think is a more egalitarian methodology than more of a elitist methodology that is proposed by Member Hess. So that's my 2 cents. And again, I'll be honest with you, if we don't do something like this, this plan is going to be dead on arrival. Because this is where the rubber meets the road. In the land use and in the general plan amendment, this is where the rubber meets the road in this plan. It is perhaps the most significant teeth this plan has. And if we don't do it right, and if we don't do it in such a way that is going to allow staff, councils, commissions to make good decisions going forward, we're going to be shooting ourselves in the foot. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Ralph, would you like to make a motion?
No, I'd actually let Ralph
Or,
has.
I'm sorry, not Ralph. I mean,
I'd-
Tom, would you like to make a motion? I'm sorry, I had Ralph on my brain. Do you have a comment, Ralph?
Yeah, I did. Thanks. So early in the meeting, maybe a half hour, 45 minutes ago, I indicated I'd be willing to amend my proposal to, no, let's go back to staff's proposal, to include the, I guess it'd be upzoning or in the residential uses that had been proposed, I guess, not to amend my plan, but was brought up by staff, so that everything on the columns that's on staff's alternative, very low density, low medium density, medium high density, everything below the black blocks, which is, I'm getting the consensus from the committee that they want those to be major amendments since it'd be up, increasing density. I said I'm fine with adding that to my proposal. And the other comment I want to make is that if you have a quality project that's presented to council, it's more than likely you're going to get the fifth vote, the one extra vote you're going to get or need in order to have a major plan amendment. The one thing that I see is the most important part of the major plan amendment criteria is the 60-day comment period. You're going to have an opportunity for the people who are going to be mostly impacted by that change have the opportunity to comment on it. And a lot of, I think, what is implied is that if it's a major plan amendment, it's not going to get approved. Well, I think that's a bad assumption because, once again, if it's a quality project, the people have the community, the neighbors, the folks who have the opportunity to comment during that 60-day comment period, that's going to be considered. And you're only going to need one more vote out of from council. And you're talking about a lot of requirements that these folks are required to meet in order to get their project approved that have nothing to do with the major plan or the rezoning application. Well, this is going to be a much less of a burden than any of those other considerations. So I think if it, so anyways, I think the plan that I've proposed as amended to meet the consensus is the best way forward. Thanks.
If I could just,
George, go
a
ahead.
very short clarification, just to make sure that we're all clear. When a rezoning application comes in, we provide notice to everyone within a certain distance. 300, 500, 600, 1,000 feet, sometimes even more than that. And they have an opportunity to comment. They have an opportunity at Planning Commission, at Council. So the 60-day period is more of the time frame for comment rather than giving or not giving people an opportunity to comment. Just want to make it clear that we never rezone without comment from the public.
Okay.
Commission members can testify to.
Yes, sometimes a lot of comment from the
I
public.
think we,
I do, if I could, before any decisions or motions made, if I could go back to your, can you? Aha, I figured I had to use that. You pushed the button. In your proposal here, you've got a little bit of a mix of land use designations and zoning categories. In the written version that you provided us originally at the last meeting and the one that we carried into this, you've only used land use categories. And I think the confusion of adding things like SPC and the NOS and RS are zoning districts and not land use categories could probably clear up some of the confusion that we would have and later confusion for the public.
Right, Ralph, yes. SPC should be mixed use. And NOS should be open space, and RS should be recreation space.
And the other concern as staff that we have to this proposal is that any change from a single family low density to multifamily high would not trigger any amendment.
But we talked about that.
Yeah.
So he's okay with sort of blending that.
So if so here what you'd rather see instead of any triggers between a major and a minor, you just want everything below the black boxes to be a major.
Okay, we're getting close to the point where we're starting to repeat the same things over again, and we can make a motion soon. But to sum this up, we have Ralph's. Basically, he wants everything to be a major change, and then we have comments from Mike Fan and Tom Riley, and also our staff talking about there are already procedures and public comment periods in the normal process that already gives the public plenty of input and is already a time-consuming process. And to make it even more time-consuming by adding an additional 60-day comment period, and then the possibility of losing water allocation and having to renew it, I am very, very much in favor of the staff alternative as written. It has minor changes, it has major changes, it uses 20 acres, 10 acres, 5 acres, 0 acres. I think the staff alternative was very, very well thought out and considered many different possibilities. And personally, I like the staff alternative as written. Does anyone want to make a motion?
yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to make a motion.
Can I just make one comment? This is Jim McCarver. I agree. I think the staff alternative is the way to go. I really feel like controlling growth is a big deal. And I think the numbers ought to be ratcheted down. 10s go to 5,
That's what he just
20s go to 10.
That's what he
Well, we can play with the numbers all day long. Yeah. I'm going to make a motion. I move to approve the major plan amendment language as staff's alternative. I'm reading your exact words.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand.
Usually have discussion.
Discussion? Okay, all right. Mary?
No, I was already.
Oh, okay. Any other discussion before we vote? Okay, all those in favor, raise your hand.
1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Okay, those opposed, raise your hand.
I'm still going to do the arbitrary negative vote.
Okay, so we have what, 7-3? The motion passes. Do we have any more comments?
No, I have a staff update.
Okay, staff update, great.
Okay. So we have your binders and here, ready for you. For those that didn't give you a binder. But you're also getting the new formatted, all pretty formatted, except for the major amendments. You know, we'll add that. But otherwise, everything else is in here. So in your binders, on the bottom layer is your ingredient to the cake. And the top is the cake batter all mixed up with the yellow highlights are your guys' changes in it, as much marked as possible. And then you'll see some green, and that's from the department heads. So there's been a lot of stuff added from the department heads when we started seeing it, and you'll see a lot of it in this format. We're really excited. I just got this yesterday, so we're very excited about it. We think it looks great. I think you guys will be really happy with it too. It is set up to be interactive, so and if you go to the table of comment, not with this, when we get the digital version, you'll be able to click on a chapter, it'll take you to it, and there's other places in the plan where you can hit buttons and it'll take you to other areas. So it's going to be very interactive, and they've been working really hard on it, the consultants, and we're ready for you guys to look at this. Please read through it very carefully for next week's meetings. This is what you're going to be voting on in next week's meeting.
All right, and you want to talk about next, okay, go ahead, James.
Question. Any of the elements that we've covered already, were there additions or deletions from the staff, other people?
It's all in here.
So
It's all in this.
we don't have to go, because we only have the last couple elements to go through.
So you'll like I said, we're done.
Okay.
We're done with the whole thing. So all the changes that were in your binders are been implemented into it, and you'll see it on the top portion. You're going to see a bunch of changes. Yellow are your guys' changes as much as we can. And then you may see notes in your binders where you had a comment, and I might have made a comment, about it. And then the green is the department head changes. We met with all the directors, and they made recommendations and changes to clarify some things that their staff they wanted to fix a little bit. So, but we're really excited, and we think you guys are really going to like it. So
are we going to vote on the plan? Is that the plan
yes,
next week?
That's the plan.
week
You're
from
going to
now.
vote on it to move it forward to the 60-day comment period.
I just want to clarify, J.D. Greenberg.
It's
We're going to be reviewing that next.
No,
I mean,
Yes,
we're looking
yes.
at that, but I'm just trying to understand what we're going to be doing next week, because if that's a done deal that's going to the public, then what are we doing next week?
Your vote next week will be to create the done deal to go to the public. So you have an opportunity to review the comments that you made, the comments that we included, the comments that came from the department heads, and the new format, so that you can see the new format as well. But you can still make changes next meeting. We do really, really need you to vote on a final version to go to the public. As much as you guys are invested in this process, I should have Terry come up with the percentage of Prescott voters that you represent. We need to hear from the rest of the public, and we need to get it out to that 60-day period so we can hear from the rest of the public.
So we
George?
still can make new comments next week?
Yes.
Okay.
George, did any department head disagree with our suggestions?
All of them disagree. No. There were most of the changes that the department heads made in the process were more of practical. I can't do this in this time frame, or we need to make this change so that it's maybe not a mandatory requirement, but a long-term 10-year, end of 10-year requirement, something like that. So no substantial deductions of things you put in.
Okay.
Are the dates set yet for the open houses?
No, we are working on dates. We have some of the locations and dates that we're probably ready to move forward on, but we need you guys to move this to the public realm in order to confirm those dates.
But we come back the last Wednesday of September.
Are we having a follow-up meeting in September? or October? For the committee.
September, we'll go through that.
I'm a slow reader.
And we'll go through that what our timeline is. We have as long as you vote on this, we have a very aggressive timeline to get this because they moved the primary up a couple of weeks to the end of July. Hence this last year, you had to vote, you voted on your primary the end of July. So we have very strict timelines that we have to get through. So we're going to go through all that and kind of show you where we're at.
One of the things Tammy's working on for next week's meeting will be basically a calendar, a follow-up calendar of what the steps are and dates for all of the steps.
Okay, any more questions about the next meeting or anything? Anybody? Okay,
Just one comment. Tammy mentioned that the shortened version, which is the light version, is also being worked on, but it's not ready yet.
okay,
But I think that's going to be a good element.
okay.
I
And then-
think one of the important things to keep in mind for that is that you have to have a complete plan for us to try to condense parts of it. And when we get to that stage, it's probably going to be well after the 60-day period before we are ready to try to create a condensed version.
Okay,
So
and
we
then,
have actually 2 copies of the plan, the corrected one and then the old one. And this is a copy of the corrected plan?
So the bottom is your ingredient that you contributed to the cake. I'm using cake because it's a little bit better than, sausage. And so that's the cake batter with everybody's comments in it on the top. And then you have the corrected, that's with everything implemented, the cake.
That's the cake with the icing.
Icing's coming, but that's the cake.
So I see green, yellow, and gray, blue. What is the gray?
Gray was still, that's what was
Deleted.
crossed out.
Oh.
Yellow are your guys's and green's the department heads.
Okay.
You'll be able to tell. And once you read the comments, you'll kind of know from sitting through all these meetings whose the comments are from. Lots of wildlife corridors.
One of the things we were a little worried about that didn't happen was compiling all of your notes, not running into a situation where there were a lot of conflicts. So we didn't have a situation where one of you said
All of one month.
4 and the other one said 6, and we had to compromise. So that didn't happen. That was good.
okay. All right, so the next meeting is 1 week from today, 2 o'clock.
Yep.
That would be August 28th.
We'll see you at 1 o'clock.
All right, any other questions, comments, suggestions? Going once, going twice? Meeting adjourned.